So, I want you to imagine the ultimate Silicon Valley tech prophet.
Okay. Like the archetype.
Right. We are talking about a guy who is actively predicting the explosion of autonomous AI. He's, architecting trillion-dollar quantum networks and writing books on global logistics clouds that run entirely on algorithms.
Oh, wow. So very grounded in code and silicon.
Exactly. Hyper digital. So, if you asked this hyper futurist what the single most critical ingredient is for a society to survive and innovate in the 2020s, what do you think he'd say?
Well, I'd assume he'd point to raw computational power
Yeah.
or, unlimited venture capital.
Right. Or maybe some massive breakthrough in machine learning.
Yeah, exactly.
But he doesn't point to any of those.
Really.
No, he points to a handshake.
Okay. That is a stunning pivot. I mean, you have a mind completely immersed in this cold, scalable logic of code,
Oh.
and he's arguing that the true engine of the future economy is something, well, something completely invisible.
Stubbornly analog, really.
Yeah, and fundamentally fragile.
It's so fascinating. So today we are going on a deep dive into this concept, which is called emotional infrastructure.
It's a great term.
Right. And our guide for this deep dive is a really layered blog post. It's dated May 10, 2026, and it's titled San Francisco's Emotional Infrastructure.
And we should mention the author.
Yes, the author is Paramendra Kumar Bhagat.
And we really have to establish who this author is, to understand the weight of his argument. Because Paramendra isn't a sociologist.
Right.
He's not like a psychologist writing about workplace feelings or HR policies.
Yeah.
He is a prolific, highly technical futurist.
Yeah, if you just glance at the sidebar of this single blog post, you are hit with this dizzying catalog of his other writing. I mean, he's published works like Lumina AI, The Trillion-Dollar Sun.
Which is an intense title.
Very. And another one, Physical AWS, How the Logistics Cloud Will Reshape Global Commerce.
Yeah, he is writing deeply technical treatises on something called agentic AI, which is...
Wait, let's define that really quick because that's crucial context.
Yeah, definitely. So when he talks about agentic AI, he isn't talking about a chatbot that just answers a question or writes an email for you.
Right, not a digital assistant.
No, he is writing about the moment artificial intelligence becomes an independent agent. So software that can be given a complex multi-day goal, and it will autonomously go out, write its own code, execute transactions, solve problems.
All without a human ever clicking a mouse.
Exactly. He is operating at the absolute bleeding edge of automation.
And he's also writing about liquid computing, which, from what I understand, is this concept of human-tech symbiosis, where computing power isn't tied to a specific device like your phone or laptop, but it flows dynamically across networks exactly as we need it.
Right. It's atmospheric. So he is consumed by algorithms, global scale, and this impending era where silicon basically does the heavy lifting of civilization.
Yet right in the middle of all these prophecies about, quantum jumps and hyperloops, he pauses.
He hits the brakes.
Yeah. He pauses to write this profound meditation on the necessity of face-to-face, unscalable human connection. It's quite the paradox.
It really is. And that is our mission today. We need to decode why a mind so completely focused on a digital trillion-dollar future has drawn this hard line in the sand, basically claiming that the greatest innovation hubs in the world are built on something that cannot be digitized.
So to understand how he arrives at this thesis, specifically about Silicon Valley, we kind of have to start thousands of miles away.
Decades in the past.
Exactly, with what we can call his Kathmandu epiphany.
I love that. So let's set the stage. The author takes us back to his childhood in Nepal.
Right. And he describes the school he attended. It wasn't just, a standard neighborhood classroom.
No, it was intense. This was the premier educational institution in the country, highly selective. You had to take rigorous nationwide entrance exams just to get a seat.
And importantly, it was built and run by the British.
Which is a really specific variable here.
It's the key variable, I'd say, because as part of the curriculum, the school had this arrangement where every year, high school graduates from England would come to Kathmandu to teach for a year. Sort of like a gap year before returning to the UK for university.
Exactly. So you had this constant influx of young, highly educated Westerners just dropping into this high-achieving Nepalese environment.
It's like the perfect setup for a culture clash. Or at least, a stark comparative observation.
Oh, definitely. And the author, who was in the 6th grade at the time, he clearly had this analytical streak early on.
Yeah, he walks right up to one of these young English teachers who had only been in Kathmandu for about a month.
Right.
And he asks this massive, sweeping question: what is the difference between your country and my country?
Which, from a 6th grader, is a pretty heavy question.
Totally. And you would expect a surface level answer, right? Like, oh, it's colder in London, or you have the Himalayas and we have the Thames.
But the teacher didn't do that.
No. The author notes that the teacher really took his time to formulate a response. And when he finally answered, he said something amazing. He said, I have been all over Kathmandu this past month. I did not see one person who was depressed. Not one.
It's a jarring observation. It is. Now, as a 6th grader, the author admits he couldn't comprehend what the teacher was talking about. He actually uses a classic philosophical metaphor to explain his confusion.
The fish one.
Yeah, referencing the old parable of a young fish asking an older fish, what's water?
Right, which David Foster Wallace made famous. The whole idea that the most ubiquitous, vital realities of our environment are the ones we are completely blind to.
Exactly. For that young boy in Kathmandu, a society functioning without widespread, visible depression wasn't some grand achievement.
It wasn't a metric to be proud of.
No, it was just the baseline reality of Tuesday. It was the water he swam in.
I have this analogy I like to use for this. It's like gravity.
Oh,
you don't feel gravity pulling you down, you just walk around. But then you watch an astronaut floating in space and you realize, oh, wow, we've been anchored this whole time.
That's a great way to put it. We're entirely blind to our emotional baseline until an outsider points it out.
So we really have to analyze why that British teacher was so astounded.
Well, he was essentially acting as a societal contrast die.
Oh, I like that.
He was coming from a highly industrialized, formalized Western society, a place where depression and isolation were visible, quantified phenomena.
They were tracked.
Exactly. And then he drops into the organic community structures of 1980s or 90s Kathmandu, and the absence of that specific psychological burden is just deafening to him.
I do want to push back on the premise of the teacher's observation, though.
Okay, sure.
Is it genuinely possible that a sprawling city like Kathmandu had literally zero depression? Or is it more likely that the society simply lacked the Western clinical vocabulary for it, so the teacher just didn't recognize how it was manifesting?
That is a very fair critique. I mean,
Right.
It's highly probable that mental illness existed.
Right. Biology is biology.
Yeah. However, the author is pointing to the scale and the isolation of it.
Okay, unpack that.
In highly communal, deeply interwoven societies, which Nepal certainly was at the time, the biological triggers for clinical depression, particularly those driven by acute isolation and lack of purpose.
Which are huge drivers.
Massive drivers. Those are heavily mitigated by the density of the community network. So you might suffer, but you rarely suffer entirely alone in a dark apartment.
Ah, I see. The communal safety net catches you before the free fall becomes visible to a tourist.
Exactly. The structure of the society prevents the extreme, visible isolation that the teacher was used to seeing back home.
That distinction really makes sense. The water in Kathmandu was a dense web of obligatory, organic, human connection.
Yeah.
And I think it prompts a really important question for anyone listening. It forces you to think about the environment you are operating in right now. What is the water that you're swimming in at your workplace or in your family?
Because you probably don't notice it.
Exactly. What emotional baseline is so incredibly normal to you that you don't even see it? Is your water a constant hum of baseline anxiety? Is everyone just low-level terrified all the time?
Or is it a profound, unstated trust? You don't realize you're operating in a specific atmosphere until someone from the outside walks in and says, wow, the energy here is tense, or you guys are incredibly relaxed.
Right. And Paramendra takes this abstract idea of water and gives it a highly structured architecture. He categorizes how societies are built into 3 distinct tiers of infrastructure.
And he uses incredibly blunt contrasts to define them.
He really does. So let's walk through these. The first tier is physical infrastructure. And his defining example is just stark. He says, China has bullet trains, California does not.
It's a devastatingly effective shorthand.
It is.
Physical infrastructure is the manifestation of a society's capability to manipulate the material world.
Right.
It requires vast capital allocation, decades of political alignment, and massive engineering capability. It is the concrete, the steel, the fiber optic cables.
This is stuff you can touch, you can measure it, you can photograph it.
Exactly.
Yeah.
It's binary. You either can move 1 million people at 300 miles an hour, or you're stuck in traffic on Interstate 5.
Right. But then he moves to the second tier, which is social infrastructure.
And to define this, he drops a deeply unsettling statistic.
Yeah. He writes, 1 out of 3 Americans lives alone.
And he immediately attaches a physiological consequence to that statistic.
Hmm.
He points out that loneliness is more injurious to health than smoking.
He calls it basic biology.
Which is true.
And we should actually dive into the biology of that claim because it sounds like a poetic exaggeration, right? Oh, a broken heart is worse than a cigarette. But it is a literal medical reality.
It absolutely is.
So when he says it's worse than smoking, what is actually happening in the body?
Okay, so when you look at the neurobiology of isolation, it's terrifying. Humans evolved to survive in deeply interconnected groups.
Tribes.
Yeah, if you were separated from your tribe on the savannah, your mortality rate skyrocketed. You were going to starve or get eaten.
So evolution wired us to panic if we're alone.
Exactly. The brain evolved an alarm system. When you are socially isolated, your amygdala triggers a constant low-grade stress response.
Just a steady drip of panic.
Yes. Your body floods with cortisol.
So it thinks you are in imminent physical danger of being eaten or freezing to death just because nobody's in the room with you.
You nailed it. And chronic cortisol exposure causes severe endothelial dysfunction.
Meaning what exactly?
It damages your blood vessels. It shortens your telomeres, which accelerates cellular aging.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. It causes systemic inflammation that degrades your immune system.
That is wild.
Smoking introduces a specific toxin into your lungs. Right?
Yeah.
Chronic loneliness essentially programs your own nervous system to slowly dismantle your cardiovascular and immune systems from the inside out.
Okay, that is incredibly grim, but it really reframes that statistic. So when Paramendra sees that 1 out of 3 people in a society is living alone, he doesn't just see a sad statistic, he sees a catastrophic structural failure.
Exactly. Just as a collapsed bridge is a failure of physical infrastructure, mass isolation is a collapse of social infrastructure.
But then he goes a layer deeper to the third tier. He moves from the physical to the social to the emotional.
And this is where it gets really nuanced.
It does. His prime example for emotional infrastructure is a dysfunctional family, a broken family, is exhibiting weak emotional infrastructure.
Right.
Now, I have to stop here because the boundary between social and emotional feels a bit blurred to me.
Okay, how so?
Well, if social infrastructure is about connection and not living alone, how is a family unit not just the ultimate social infrastructure? Why do we need a separate tier for emotional?
That is the crucial distinction to make. Think of it this way. Social infrastructure is merely the container.
The container, okay.
Yeah. And emotional infrastructure is the payload.
The container and the payload. I like that. Flesh that out for me.
Okay, let's use his example of the family. You can have a family of 4 living in a single house. They eat dinner at the same table every night. From a purely statistical standpoint, they have strong social infrastructure.
Right, they check the census box. They aren't part of the living alone demographic.
Exactly. The container is completely intact.
But if that family hates each other?
Bingo. If there is verbal abuse, if there is a complete lack of psychological safety, if the children are terrified of making a mistake,
Then the emotional infrastructure is practically non-existent.
exactly. The physical proximity is there, the social grouping is there, but the emotional payload is completely toxic.
Wow.
Social infrastructure dictates whether people are in the room together. Emotional infrastructure dictates whether the people in that room feel brave, secure, and understood.
That completely changes how you look at a workplace, too.
Oh, absolutely.
A company might pride itself on its open plan office and, mandatory Friday happy hours.
We have ping pong tables.
Great, we're a family. That is just aggressive social infrastructure. But if everyone is secretly terrified of the CEO and hoarding information to protect their own jobs, the emotional infrastructure is bankrupt.
Precisely.
Yeah.
And a broken family is the deepest, most foundational fracture.
Why the family specifically?
Because if a human being cannot learn how to build trust and safety within their core biological unit, their family, it becomes exponentially more difficult for them to scale that trust outward into a community, a corporation, or a society later in life.
They never learned how to carry the payload.
Exactly.
Which brings us to the core of his thesis. Because he takes this deeply psychological framework, physical, social, and emotional tiers, and he applies it directly to the most scrutinized, hyper-competitive, wealth-generating ecosystem on the planet.
San Francisco and Silicon Valley.
Right. And his claim here is incredibly specific. He states that San Francisco possesses a super strong emotional infrastructure for founders.
And crucially, he adds that this kind of infrastructure takes generations to build. It's not overnight.
He backs this up with a piece of tech history that I find fascinating. He brings up the very first angel investor in Google.
Which is a legendary story.
We all know the mythology of Google starting in a garage, right? Larry and Sergey building servers out of Legos. But the author points out that the first person to actually write them a check wasn't some Wall Street banker in a suit.
No, it was Andy Bechtolsheim.
Right, who was a co-founder of Sun Microsystems.
And the timeline he emphasizes is the key variable here. Sun Microsystems was founded in 1982. Google was founded roughly 15 years later, in the late 90s.
And the author writes this sentence that, for me, completely recontextualizes the history of venture capital. He says, a lot of people have 100K, but only he would have written the check. That is emotional infrastructure.
If we really analyze that statement, we see how it dismantles the standard narrative of how innovation actually happens.
Yeah, we usually think innovation is just a product of access to information and access to capital. Give smart people money and books and boom, innovation.
But the author explicitly rejects that. He points out that information is already democratized. Anyone can read the blogs, buy the textbooks, or watch the tutorials on YouTube.
Right, the coding languages are open source. The knowledge is literally everywhere. You can be in a basement in Ohio and learn to code.
Exactly. And he also dismisses the idea that it's just about raw money. He explicitly states the money is in New York.
Which is factually true.
Yes, the vast majority of global capital, the massive hedge funds, the generational banking wealth that is concentrated in Manhattan, not Northern California.
So if New York has the money and the internet has the information, why did the future get built in San Francisco? Why did Google happen there?
Because of pattern recognition and mimetic desire, which are core components of emotional infrastructure.
Okay, unpack that. Pattern recognition.
When Andy Bechtolsheim looked at Larry Page and Sergey Brin, he wasn't looking at them through the lens of a traditional financier.
Right, a New York banker in 1998 would have demanded like a 5-year risk-adjusted return projection for a search engine that had no revenue and no business model.
And they would have laughed them out of the room. But Bechtolsheim didn't need that spreadsheet. He had the lived psychological experience of being a crazy founder himself 15 years prior.
He recognized the neurosis.
Exactly. He understood the specific, terrifying ambition of trying to build something that defied current logic.
Yeah.
He provided an emotional safety net.
So the money was almost secondary?
The $100,000 check was just the physical manifestation of a much deeper psychological transaction. It was a transfer of belief.
I love that, a transfer of belief. It's like a generational relay race, but the baton they're passing isn't actually the money. The baton is the permission to attempt the impossible.
And more importantly, the permission to fail.
Yes, because in that ecosystem, cratering a startup into the ground wasn't a mark of permanent social exile. It was practically a badge of initiation.
Right, you failed. Great. What did you learn? Here's another check. You can't get that in a purely financial help.
But I would push back a little here just on whether this is a uniquely San Francisco phenomenon forever or just a snapshot of a specific era.
That's an interesting point.
Because if this emotional infrastructure is so robust and it takes generations to build, how do we explain the current reality? We've seen massive numbers of founders and venture capitalists flee San Francisco for places like Austin or Miami or El Segundo.
Right.
So is this 2026 author romanticizing a Silicon Valley that actually died a decade ago?
That is a brilliant question. I mean, if the emotional infrastructure was truly invincible, a little bit of high rent or local political friction shouldn't have shattered it.
Exactly. They should have stayed for the infrastructure.
But I think the answer actually reinforces his theory.
How so?
Because emotional infrastructure is incredibly fragile. Think about what happens to a tech hub when it becomes massively successful. The organic founders, the crazy risk takers, they are gradually replaced by financial engineers, optimizers, and middle managers.
Ah, the spreadsheet people arrive.
Yes, the water changes. The ecosystem shifts from asking, how do we build the impossible, to how do we extract the maximum margin?
The container stays the same. Everyone is still physically in the Bay Area, but the payload changes from radical trust to risk aversion.
Precisely. And when that payload turns toxic, the true founders have to leave to find or build new emotional infrastructure elsewhere. So the fact that people are leaving SF doesn't disprove his theory. It proves that once the emotional infrastructure decays, all the physical and social advantages of a city cannot hold the talent.
Wow, that makes perfect sense. And here's the paradox that makes this specific text so mind-bending to me.
Yeah.
The author, who spends his days theorizing about autonomous AI agents and liquid computing networks, this guy insists that this emotional infrastructure cannot be digitized.
That's adamant about it.
Yeah, he writes, and that emotional infrastructure is an in-person thing. You have to feel it in person. Video calls don't do it.
It is an incredible contradiction.
It really is.
But often, the people most intimately familiar with the capabilities of advanced technology are the ones who possess the clearest understanding of its hard limits.
Oh, that's so true.
He knows precisely how many petabytes of data can be pushed through a fiber optic cable. And because he knows that limit, he knows that digital networks fundamentally fail to transmit the biological resonance of human trust.
But what is it exactly that fails to translate over a screen? I mean, we have 4K video, we have spatial audio. Why doesn't the Zoom call work for this specific type of infrastructure?
Because trust relies on friction and microbiology.
Microbiology.
Yeah. A video screen perfectly transmits information, right? It can convey the pitch deck, the financial models, the verbal argument, but it strips away the subconscious data our evolutionary biology relies on to assess threat and safety.
Like what?
It strips away pheromones. It flattens micro-expressions that lag by a millisecond on a digital connection. You cannot feel the kinetic energy or the tension in a room.
You can't smell the sweat.
Literally. The digital world is engineered to eliminate friction. But deep emotional infrastructure, the kind that allows you to hand a stranger millions of dollars for a crazy idea, is forged exclusively in the friction of shared physical vulnerability.
You have to look them in the actual eye, not the webcam.
Exactly.
Okay, so if San Francisco, at least in its golden era, represents the triumph of organic, generational, emotional infrastructure, the author then takes us to the dark inverse of that.
Right. What happens when an organic infrastructure is actively disrupted?
And for this, we go back to Nepal.
He paints a picture of a tragic loss here. Remember the Kathmandu of his youth? The society with the profound communal safety net and the zero visible depression.
Right, the healthy water, the village raising the child.
But then he writes, then Western consultants showed up.
And he delivers this incredibly sharp critique. It's almost visceral. He says, the people who melt your Himalayas want to teach you conservation.
It is a profound, cutting sentence.
It's heavy.
Let's look at the mechanics of the friction he is describing here. He is outlining a fundamental clash between two diametrically opposed methods of organizing human behavior.
Okay, what are the two methods?
The bottom-up organic system versus the top-down formalized system.
So how do those two systems actually interact when they collide? Because obviously consultants are brought in to help, ostensibly.
Right. Well, the organic emotional infrastructure of Nepal wasn't designed in a boardroom. It evolved over centuries through shared hardship, religious practices, extended family units, and deeply ingrained cultural obligations.
It grew like a forest, not a grid.
Beautifully put.
Yeah.
It was highly inefficient on paper, but it produced immense psychological resilience. Then, the Western consultants arrive, and they represent a system optimized entirely for measurable efficiency, KPIs, and structured development.
The spreadsheet approach.
Yes. And the irony he is highlighting is that the civilization arriving to fix the developing nation is the exact same civilization whose relentless pursuit of industrial efficiency has caused the macro-environmental disaster.
The melting of the Himalayan glaciers.
Exactly.
The people who melt your Himalayas want to teach you conservation. It's the ultimate paradox of the expert who possesses all the data but completely misunderstands the water.
The problem with top-down consultants is that they only know how to manipulate physical and social infrastructure.
Because that's all you can measure.
Exactly. They can redraw the org chart, build a new road, or implement a new legal framework. But in doing so, they almost always sever the invisible emotional ties that actually held the society together.
They cut the roots.
They replace implicit biological trust with explicit bureaucratic rules. And there is a well-known concept called Goodhart's Law. When a measure becomes a target, it ceases to be a good measure. By trying to measure and optimize the society, they drain the very trust that made it resilient in the first place.
I think anyone who has worked in corporate America has lived through a micro version of this exact tragedy.
Oh, absolutely. Give me an example.
Imagine a mid-sized company with an unbelievable culture. It grew organically. The team covers for each other when someone's kid is sick. They brainstorm brilliantly because no one is afraid of sounding stupid. The emotional payload is perfect.
It's a thriving mini ecosystem, high trust, high output.
Right. Then the company gets acquired. The new parent company looks at this messy organic group and says, we need to optimize this. We need to scale this culture.
The death knell.
Yep. They bring in an outside consulting firm. The consultants mandate new tracking software. They force everyone into structured synergy workshops. And they replace organic mentorship with a formalized, HR-tracked buddy system.
And what happens to that baseline of trust?
It evaporates immediately.
Completely vanishes.
People stop taking risks and start covering their own tracks. The consultants tried to spreadsheet the emotional infrastructure, and in the process, they destroyed the invisible magic that made the company valuable in the first place. You cannot mandate a feeling of safety from a corner office.
That analogy captures his point perfectly. Whether it is a corporate acquisition or international development, when you impose a rigid external framework onto a complex, organic, emotional ecosystem, you crush the resilience you were supposedly trying to enhance.
So this leaves us with a massive question about the future, because the author doesn't just want to mourn Nepal or analyze a Google check from 1998.
No, he is a futurist. His eyes are locked on the horizon.
In the final section, he asks the critical question: can San Francisco's emotional infrastructure be replicated somewhere else?
And his answer is incredibly confident, but it comes with a strict condition.
What's the condition?
He writes, sure, but it would require an in-person congregation of founders.
In-person congregation. That specific phrasing feels almost religious.
It does. Congregation implies shared belief.
And if you look at the author's broader context around May 2026, you realize he isn't just theorizing about this, he is actively trying to manufacture it.
Yes.
At the exact time he published this post, he was engaging in a massive public networking campaign on social media.
Right. He was tweeting about moving back to San Francisco just to use Twitter from San Francisco.
Which is such a funny meta thing to do. And he was tagging titans of the tech industry: Vinod Khosla, Mark Andreessen, Ben Horowitz.
He's attempting to force his way into that specific generational emotional infrastructure. He wants to be physically in the room with the people who hold the baton.
But he isn't doing this just to launch like a standard software as a service app or a dating clone. He frames this absolute need for human congregation within a staggeringly grand vision.
It's sweeping.
The very first sentence of this blog post, which kind of serves as the thesis statement for his entire worldview, reads, "The impending age of abundance was prophesied in the scriptures thousands of years ago."
This is the moment where all the disparate, paradoxical threads of his writing weave together.
Explain that.
If you look at his other titles, books like Calcusum, The Economic and Spiritual Blueprint for an Age of Abundance, you see a mind synthesizing ancient spiritual theology with the absolute cutting edge of artificial general intelligence and global logistics.
He genuinely believes that humanity is standing on the threshold of an era of unimaginable technology-driven abundance, like a post-scarcity world.
Exactly. He sees agentic AI and liquid computing as the tools that will eradicate scarcity. The machines will do the work, figure out the logistics, and cure the diseases.
But the crux of his philosophy is that the AI will not autonomously usher us into this utopia.
No.
The algorithms are merely the vehicle.
The engine that actually drives humanity through the gateway into this age of abundance is fundamentally, unalterably human.
It requires a physical congregation of brilliant, ambitious people who possess the emotional infrastructure to support each other's wildest visions without fear.
It is a surprisingly beautiful conclusion for a tech futurist.
It really is.
Despite all his research into code, silicon, and quantum mechanics, his ultimate conclusion is that you cannot replace the biological friction of human presence. Technology can scale infinitely, but trust is stubbornly analog.
If you want to build the technological future, you have to gather the builders in one physical space and allow the messy, inefficient, organic roots of emotional infrastructure to take hold.
You have to get in the room.
You have to get in the room. So let's look back at the scope of what we've covered today. We started with a young boy in Kathmandu discovering that a society without visible depression wasn't a miracle, it was just the water of a healthy community.
We examined the severe biological consequences of modern isolation, realizing that social infrastructure isn't just about friendliness, it is a matter of cardiovascular and neurological survival.
And we defined how emotional infrastructure is the true payload of safety within those social containers. It's the difference between eating dinner in silence and eating dinner in joy.
We dissected the generational relay race of Silicon Valley, understanding that venture capital is often just the physical manifestation of a psychological safety net, passed from one former founder to a new one.
We analyze the destructive friction between organic, bottom-up trust and top-down, formalized optimization.
Seeing how external interventions, like those consultants, often destroy the very resilience they seek to measure.
And we arrived at a futurist's ultimate prophecy, that the gateway to a high-tech age of abundance requires the ancient low-tech magic of in-person human congregation.
So when we synthesize all of this, what does it mean for you, the listener?
Right. Because you may not be architecting the next trillion-dollar AI network, and you may not be a venture capitalist writing $100,000 checks to a garage startup.
But you are, without question, the architect of the emotional infrastructure in your immediate surroundings.
Every single day, you are building it. You are constructing it in how you react when your child makes a mistake.
You are building it in how you respond when a colleague pitches a half-baked, slightly crazy idea in a meeting.
Yes. Do you shoot it down instantly, or do you explore it? Every interaction is either adding to that invisible safety net, or it is quietly tearing it down.
You are actively determining the chemical composition of the water your team and your family swim in. You're either fostering a space of radical trust, or you are acting as the outside consultant, optimizing the joy and safety right out of the room.
I want to leave you with a final thought to turn over in your mind long after we finish here. Think back to Andy Bechtelheim, writing that first check to the founders of Google. The crucial detail was the time gap. He wrote that check 15 years after he started his own terrifying journey with Sun Microsystems.
True emotional infrastructure is not transactional. It isn't about what you can extract from someone at a networking event today.
It is a massive long-term investment in human potential.
It is the definition of planting a tree under whose shade you never expect to sit.
Exactly. So look at the congregation of people in your life right now, your family, your coworkers, your community. Are you cultivating an environment where 15 years from today, someone will feel brave enough, safe enough, and supported enough to take a leap that changes the world?
The infrastructure that will actually carry us into the future isn't made of fiber optics. It's made of us.